Hello, and welcome to another exciting episode of the Feudal Future podcast. I'm Marshall Toplansky.
I'm Joel Kotkin.
And today we are going to be tackling one of the toughest issues that's facing America today, which is the tremendous sense of political divide that we have in our political philosophy. And to help us with that, we've invited F.H. Buckley, Professor Frank Buckley from George Mason University's Law School, to talk about it and talk about his new book entitled Progressive Conservatism. Frank, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure to have you. Joel, you want to start us off?
Yeah, I mean, what we were just talking about is, Frank is a Canadian and lived in Quebec during the secession crisis that took place there many decades ago. Are we headed to a secession crisis in the United States, and will it be different than the one that Canada faced?
Well, first of all, let me correct you. Yes, I am Canadian, but I'm also American. I became an American on April 15, 2014, in other words, tax day. They said, welcome to America, here's your bill. But yes, I did live through a secession crisis in Canada, but a crisis that was conducted with a great deal more collegiality and enduring friendships than anything we see in divided America. So, being down here and having lived through the experience in Quebec, one wonders, how is it the country is able to stay together, but for the legal inertia of getting undone? We're at a Carl Schmitt moment. He's the German philosopher who talked about all politics being a matter of friends versus enemies. The divides have never been greater. The animosities have not been greater, right? It's down to the level of losing friendships amongst your neighbors. It's really quite pathetic. And I guess you might want to wonder whether or not we'd be emotionally better off in two separate countries. It's hard to do, but it's certainly doable.
Well, and your point is that if you look at the political philosophy of both the Republican and the Democratic Party, that there's actually room for optimism, for crafting some kind of a compromise that embodies the values of America, where we could actually create a broader majority, a broader consensus about where we're going. Could you talk about that a little?
Yes, I'm very much in favor of anything which brings us together, though I note that this is harder to do now than it was in the past. In the past, we could point to simple patriotism, but that's a little bit harder to do when from the left you hear the message that everything you love is dirty, that all American history is simply a tale of great misbehavior, of slavery, of everything being rotten. And so, the simple thing which would ordinarily bring people together, love of country, is seemingly lost because it's been so much under attack in the last couple of days. And I think we have to get over that. And I think we have to look for those kinds of things which would heal us a little bit. And so I wrote a book entitled Progressive Conservatism, in which I said the onus is essentially upon the GOP to try to reinvent itself as a party in which everyone can feel proud of America, right? It's hard to feel good about a political party, the Democrats, where the basic message is half of America is hateful, or where President Biden said, the MAGA Republicans are semi-fascists. This is the kind of language, divisive language, that makes it impossible to have that kind of healing. And so in my book, I suggested the answer can be found by reimagining American history, not in terms of North versus South, but East versus West. North versus South, that's been the subject of the last several years of debate. And it's one in which, frankly, Republicans, conservatives, Russell Kirk, I'm thinking of you, were on the wrong side. But after the Civil War, a new way of thinking about America emerged from a guy called Frederick Jackson Turner, one of the greatest historians in America, who said, no, the story of America is a story of the West versus the East. And the West is the frontier. And there was always a frontier, right? 200 to 250 years ago, the frontier was Charlottesville. It was the Shenandoah. And then it became the further west. And I'm originally from Western Canada. So, I have a strong sense of West versus East issues, as did Turner. The same themes resonate today. If you're a Westerner, said Turner, you see the question of one of aristocracy versus mobility. So if you're in the West, this is where anybody can get ahead. We don't care where you came from.
Self-reliance and rugged individualism.
I think it was more than that, because those people in the West did actually depend upon the U.S. cavalry, okay, and the Union Pacific and so on. No, before you get into something that looks like ideology, just think in terms of aristocracy versus mobility. And the reason why I think that's important is because today we really do terribly on mobility rankings. We are immobile, as immobile as Britain. The big winners in terms of mobility rankings are countries like Denmark and Canada. Okay, and if you think you'd like to live in a country where your kids will have it as well off or better than you did, which used to be called the American dream, okay, you want to know why we're not doing it and why the American dream is fled offshore, and why George Carlin said the reason why it's called the American dream is you have to be asleep to believe in it, right? And it's particularly important for Republicans to do this, because the villains here are people on the left, right? I mean, what makes a country mobile, people mobile, is a good educational system, right? Well, who do you blame for that? The destruction of our K-12 schools, but for that important democratic ally, the teachers' unions, right? Immigration, we actually import immobility by not screening immigrants on the basis that they'd make ordinary Americans better off. And we have a plethora of regulations that get in the way of people who want to move up in the rankings. So in all of those respects, we've made ourselves immobile. It's kind of like structural racism. Okay, when people talk about structural racism, you want to ask them, who do you think built the structure? All right. So, we're talking about an entrenched liberal state that has worked really well for people at the very top end of the income distribution. Their kids are going to be rich. The kids at the bottom end are going to be poor, right? And in between, for the people in the middle, you have a more or less immobile society. This should have been a GOP issue, but what got in the way was their ideology. And and one thing I'm arguing for here is a reversal of 60 years of right-wing ideology, right, which began with the 64 election with the Goldwater.
AUH2O.
AUH2O, and frankly, at the time, I loved the guy, but it's been a dead end, right? It's made the Republicans essentially the designated losers in American politics. Very right-wing on cultural issues, very right-wing on economic issues. That's not where the voters are. Where the voters are is economically middle of the road or left of center and socially conservative. And that's a sweet spot in American politics. And that's a territory that Trump wanted in 2016. And I know because I was there, I was helping to craft the message. And I thought that was a winning message. And, I think the results proved me out. And so that's one part of it. The American dream has gone south, or more accurately, north.
But just a quick, before you get into the further parts of how to
Sure.
bridge the gap, just a quick thought for you. Isn't it hard for Republicans to think that countries like Denmark and Canada are doing a better job of implementing the American dream than we are?
Yeah,
You have this whole socialist taint of those countries, and I think if you're on the right-hand side of the aisle, it just probably doesn't sit well with you to think that these countries are doing better than we are at it.
Gee, you're saying emulate Canada is not a winner? I mean, I guess
Or
maybe that's
Denmark,
right.
Emulate Sweden.
Yeah, but you know something? That's pretty much what I would do. I mean, if you ask yourself, why are they mobile and why aren't we? Well, one reason is frankly Medicare. Okay. Now, very early on, I told Jared Kushner, Canadian Medicare is better than people think it is, but we can do a lot better, which was a line that Trump repeated the next day. He said, not, I'm going to repeal Obamacare. He said, I'm going to repeal Obamacare and replace it with something better. But in office, the guy was an ineffective president. He was a failed president. He didn't get Trumpism enacted. He ran into, in his first 2 years, Paul Ryan and a Libertarian Congress, and thereafter with the nonsense of the Russian collusion story with the Democrats, right? So, he couldn't get things done. He was, frankly, a failure in that respect. But, but there are things like that you would do. You would tackle the obscene tuition fees at American colleges. For example, I proposed several times at the White House a form of debt relief for educational loans. I said, give them bankruptcy discharges, but make the universities pick up the tab and refuse to guarantee tuition for any college that charges more than $25,000 a year in tuition. These are kind of simple things you can do. But what we did is we started this educational loan program, and unlike every other country, we didn't ask the colleges to cap their tuition. Right? Huge mistake. So, so the big winners yesterday with Trump's, with Biden's decision to forgive loans is going to be the colleges. Right. The one constituency that will never be betrayed by the Democratic Party is the educational establishment, either K-12 or higher ed. And this stinks.
But the question I have is, okay, I can see where the Republicans can make a point on this, but I don't see how they make a point on anything as long as Donald Trump is the dominant figure in the party. I just, people just can't see past that. I mean, many of the things that you talk about with progressive conservatism, I think, like Governor Youngkin would clean up. I mean, the Republicans should pick up 80 seats this year, but they're going to pick up, I think, if they're lucky, they'll pick up 20. Yeah. And part of the problem is, as long as you've got Donald Trump there, there's, I mean, frankly, I find him just nauseating on it, just to watch.
I agree entirely with you. Initially, one trained oneself to avert one's gaze. Mm-hmm. And then you look more closely when you saw he couldn't do the job, that he was an ineffective president. And now he's simply toxic. He's the best thing the Democrats have. All they have is Donald Trump, Donald Trump, Donald Trump, which is why they can't let go, right? It's why they're funding the Democratic donors, something called the Republican Accountability Project, which is pouring money into races against Trump candidates. And of course, the Trump candidates themselves are not merely an embarrassment, they're the reason why the Republicans won't pick up the Senate. So everything he does is toxic. And it's important to say goodbye in a very nice way. One doesn't have to be insulting, but it's time to go. Show him the door.
Well, and is it, you talk in your book about his narcissism. Is it, even in the beginning of the Trump presidency, was that narcissism trumping, excuse the pun, his commitment to a political agenda, to a philosophical agenda, or was that philosophical agenda just never there, really?
Well, to the extent there was a philosophical agenda, I had something of a hand in preparing it. I mean, the idea of the decline of the American dream became a big theme because I had been pushing it. The idea of corruption had become was a theme with which he began, but I certainly helped in that as well. So you have the man and you have his ideas, and I was behind the latter, and I averted my gazes to the former until I realized that not merely was he in fact ineffective as an administrator, but he had such a poor choice with respect to appointments. He surrounded himself with creeps. Okay, I mean, I don't have to get into names, but you know pretty much what I'm talking about. Really quite unpleasant sycophants, people with crazy ideas about crazy philosophers in Eastern Europe, quite un-American ideas. And he didn't let go of them. As for his cabinet appointments, some were simply quite weak, like Betsy DeVos, and some were decent, honorable people, General Mattis, whom he simply couldn't get to agree with him. He didn't vet them. You pick people who are going to agree with you, good people who are going to agree with you. He picked good people, but not people who would agree with him. And of course, if you're a Trump person right now, oh well, you hate those people. You hate Tillerson. But they were decent people. And what remains, that which is decent in the Republican Party, include people who were in the administration, like Attorney General Barr, for example. So, there is a core of good people. But I think what the GOP has to do here is find a way out which does not involve Trump, but also which does not involve torching his ideas and reverting to Goldwater conservatism, because that's not going to do the trick either.
Well, and it sounds like from what you're saying in your book, if the Republicans can annex part of the Democratic agenda, the social progressivism of the Democratic agenda to some degree, that's where the opportunity lies to create a broader majority party.
That's what Eisenhower did.
Yeah, we knew that all along. Look, I very early on in 2016, I had dinner with a vice president of the Koch Institute, big libertarian. And he said, "Who are you voting for?" And I said, "Trump." And he said, "I kind of like him, but what about entitlements?" And I said, "You idiot." I didn't say this. I thought, "You idiot, you don't get it. We're on the side of entitlements. We're on the side of welfare policy. We're not right-wing the way you are. This is a new party." Somebody asked Trump at one point, "Gee, are you a conservative?" And he said, "Look, it's called the Republican Party, not the Conservative Party." So, yeah, I think going back to an earlier Republican Party of Lincoln and Teddy Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower would be the way back. I mean, Eisenhower was genuinely a really noble guy and the most popular president in the last century. Very much on the right side with respect to civil rights issues, unlike the National Review crowd, for example. Very much on the right side of making peace with the New Deal, which is, what Americans wanted, but it's not what the hardcore GOPers like Bob Taft wanted. So he reinvented a party which was going to do precisely what that great progressive conservative Benjamin Disraeli did in dishing the Whigs, right? And steal their message. If that's what people want, then that's what you have to do. And if you do it, you'll do it better than the Democrats ever would. I mean, you wouldn't do anything as crazy as the debt forgiveness plan announced yesterday by President Biden for educational loans. We'd couple it with other things to make it work.
But the question I have is, how are you ever going? I mean, it seems to me that the Republican Party right now is dominated by the lunatics of the religious right, and sort of the Trumpistas who are now increasingly seem to be a sort of conspiracy-driven authoritarian kind of movement. I don't see where there's anything in between those two things. I find like Republicans, let's say here in California, a lot of them support policies that make it impossible to have a single family home here, that they want to, they have this blind idea, well, the market's efficient no matter what it does. I don't
It's
see
like,
this.
it's like that great line in the movie A Touch of Evil said by Marlene Dietrich, "Honey, you're a mess." The Republican Party is a mess, right? You've got a Trump bandwagon where the money is is essentially Goldwater type money. It's hardcore right-wing money. They haven't learned what Trump is all about. And then you have the guys who can't let go of the 2020 election. I've said that in the case of the Democrats, what we're seeing is a decline in the idea of Republican virtue, and with the hardcore Trump voters, we're paying them back with interest. And I think, the answer has to come over time from people who realize none of these things are going to work. What's not going to work is a flip back to the GOP of 1964 to Mitt Romney. That has been tried and failed. Okay, and what's not going to work is Trump as a person, and the 2020 election. I mean, we have to get past that. The only thing left, well, two things. One is, the notion, the reality that the winning coalition is socially conservative and economically middle of the road. So I always thought, what you want to do is you want to give some sensible form of medical insurance for catastrophic illness, okay, and make that a Republican Party. And as for the Democrats, we'll give them transgender bathrooms, okay? That's the contrast I'd like to see. We'll take on social conservatism in a smart way. And by the way, a smart way means making allowances for abortion, right? No blanket ban on abortion, but something like the rules one finds in Europe, right? So a ban on abortion after 20 weeks, it might be, which is what Governor Youngkin wants, right? We have an opportunity for moral seriousness in all of that. And we also have a moment to try to recover the idea of Republican virtue. So, one of the elements of Turner's thesis was the West is egalitarian and mobile, and the East is aristocratic. Another idea is the East is corrupt and the West is the home of Republican virtue. And Republican virtue is an idea that it goes back to Florence, Renaissance Florence. The idea
it goes back to Rome, actually.
It goes back to Cicero. You're quite right. Okay.
I had 7 years of Latin. It's got to be good for something.
There were two American foundings, and we have to recover the first. The first American founding is 1776, and that was a moment of Republican virtue, where people thought, look, there's something greater than ourselves, and what is needed is a sense of disinterested virtue. And then you have a constitutional moment as interpreted by James Madison, who's not a big winner at the convention. His ideas did not get adopted in Philadelphia. But afterwards, he wrote up the Federalist Papers with Hamilton to describe what he thought was the product of the Constitution, what it meant. And that became an anti-virtue document, right? There's no such thing as Republican virtue. We're all basically vicious, self-interested people. And the only thing you can do is try to blunt this, okay? So, that message the GOP has taken to heart. I want to suggest that that's not where Lincoln was coming from. I don't think that's Teddy Roosevelt, and certainly not Dwight Eisenhower. I'd like to recover the idea that what is required for good government is disinterested virtue. The founders, the 1776 founders, knew exactly that. If we want to unite America around something greater than ourselves, what we have to do is let go of democratic pluralism where we're all separate constituencies who fight for their seat at the table. No, we have to ask from everyone, look, you're an American and something is required of you. And what is required of you is a commitment to the good of the country as a whole, to the common good, not the particular good, not the pluralist good, not your constituency, but something greater than yourself. And if you do that, if the GOP does that, it will be the one party in which you can join and feel proud to join. And that's, I think there's a hunger amongst Americans for something that's not dirty. And only the...
I think that it's in your book, you make a couple of fascinating analogies of how that how that approach has been a magnet for bringing the country together in the past. And one of the examples you use is that FDR basically used that approach to bring in the New Deal, to get us out of the Depression in the 1930s, and that at heart, it was a progressive conservative message.
It was not merely a progressive conservative message, but progressive conservative Republicans joined the administration to support that. And, right wingers now will say, well, there were a lot of ideas behind that which were simply bad ideas. The Blue Eagle was a bad idea. The NRA was a bad idea. But FDR knew, like most people, knew beans about economics at the time. And what he did is he simply threw a lot of policies on the wall to see which would stick. And in the end, he presided over this extraordinary expansion in the American economy, right? 10% a year for 4 years running. And his second term was a bit more dismal, but his first term was absolutely glorious. And, and of course, in 1940 and 1944, I should certainly have voted for him for foreign policy reasons. So he should be remembered fondly by progressive conservatives.
So Frank, looking ahead, as we try to tie this together, I like what you say. I said to my wife, I said, if this book, if this became the Bible of the Republican Party, I would join in 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. But I don't see the mechanism for doing it. I don't see a movement. I don't see a candidate. I don't see any evidence. I see, some interesting thoughts in, frankly, mostly in British and Australians publications about some of these ideas. But where do we look for hope? I don't see anybody. I mean, it's Trump and the Trumpettes, basically.
Well, I agree with you. And I guess my answer is, after having spoken about the need for Republican virtue, disinterested virtue, I'm rather hoping that self-interest will prompt the GOP to do the right thing here. I think that smarter people in the GOP will realize that the future for them is not going to be simply of flipping back to the GOP's ideological right-wing policies of the last 60 years. They're going to have to reach out for the middle, and they're going to have to govern sensibly, right? They're going to have to give up things like absolute abortion bans and compromise, or else they wither and die. So that's the choice, right? The choice is basically adapt or die.
Do you have a 12-point contract for America outlined in your book, which I thought was kind of fascinating?
Yeah, well, maybe a little narcissistic, whatever. Okay.
So you want to just go through that a little bit for people and tell us what where you see the greatest need for change?
Well, in a contrarian response, let me talk about the progressive end of it. When polled, most Americans say we'd like to have some relief from the possibility of, economic devastation because of a catastrophic illness. So we don't object to paying $25 or $40 for, a doctor's visit. But the idea that we can somehow park ourselves into a hospital and end up bankrupt when we emerge, that's chilling for most Americans. So the one thing you can do is try to prevent that from happening. So some form of national insurance based on catastrophic health would do that which Obamacare was supposed to do and didn't do. I mean, Obamacare, I don't want to get into it, but Obamacare was absolutely terrible policy. So, I'm on the side of doing that which Trump said he would do, replace Obamacare with something beautiful. And it's the extreme devastation of catastrophic illness that bothers a majority of Americans and would be very much appreciated by them. And, a Republican Party that did that would find itself applauded the same way Disraeli was when he stole issues from the left. So, that would be one thing. But, in other respects, progressive conservative agenda would be conservative as well as progressive, taking on the educational bloat, for example, offering free choices as to schools, and going after the absurd tuition costs at American universities. I mean, my suggestion was, if you made the university pay or bear the economic burden of a bankruptcy of educational debt, you would see the crazy majors in higher ed disappear instantly, right? Anybody going for a gender studies to MA is guaranteed unemployable, okay? So that's kind of where the problem is.
Well, they can go work for Coca-Cola in the HR department.
Well,
Yeah,
you have chief diversity officers now within companies. So I'm not so sure that it would be, you would find that to be unemployable.
Well, maybe not, but that's their problem. Let them live with it. I think
Right.
those kinds of things are self-correcting in the end, right? I mean, we're at a crazy moment where absolutely stupid ideas seem to dominate, carried along by a press which buoys them up. But I'm not a natural lawyer, but I think there is a self-righting tendency in American politics that Americans, in the end, will be, after being presented with stupid ideas, will reject them.
Other than Glenn Youngkin, who you pointed out earlier, kind of fit a little bit of the mold of what you're talking about, do you see anybody else emerging that could be the exemplar for this particular approach?
I'm not into retail politics, so I don't pay all that much attention to that. I put a photograph in my book of Margaret Chase Smith, okay, whom I kind of like. She was in Doonesbury, Lacey Davenport. I don't know if one remembers that.
Well, and for those of you who are not familiar with Margaret Chase Smith, she's a former congressperson from the state of Maine in the 50s and 60s.
Who honorably was the first person to go after Joe McCarthy. Okay. When National Review decided that Joe McCarthy was just peachy, that was not their greatest moment. They had a lot of bad moments. That was one of them. So yeah, look, I can't say who's going to emerge. I can simply say what is demanded. I can't talk about the supply side, just the demand side. The demand side is for a Youngkin, right? So, so the crazies, the absolute crazy Senate candidates that Bush has been pushing, which are in the news,
I mean,
they
Trump.
won't be in the Trump, sorry. They won't be in the news in 6 months' time. They'll be toast, right? So that's one way of taking care of that problem, right? Let's just observe how everything that Trump touches is toxic, and those people will disappear. So,
well, and hopefully what will come afterward will be closer to what you're proposing, which is kind of a way of bridging the gap between the left and the right, not just in the Republican Party, but in the country as a whole. And for that, we're very grateful to have you as a guest on the Feudal Future podcast. Thank you so much.
thank you for having me.
Great.
Thank you.